Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to have a look at this set of stone walls by Warlord Games. First, I would like to say a big thank you to my most excellent patrons, without whom I would not have been able to pick up this kit. Thank you very much. There's not really going to be much to building these, so I'm also going to paint them in this video, but let's have a quick look at what's in the box anyway. All you get is this bag which contains two identical sprues. Some of the parts did come loose from the sprues in the box, which would normally bother me, but no damage has been done. I think this happened because the parts are quite heavy. I don't imagine it would take a great deal of force to get them to break free from the sprue. No parts were lost and no damage has been done, so I can't complain too much. The detail on these is about what I would expect. It's pretty decent and it looks like stones arranged to form a wall. What more could you really want? The gaps and cracks are deep enough that they should take a wash pretty well. Some of the walls are damaged and I think that looks pretty good and adds some variety and interest. There are fairly prominent mould lines, not super bad but they are very obvious. These are easy to remove. They're mostly on the flat, undetailed ends and bottoms of the parts, so there's not really any detail to worry about damaging when removing them. There are also a couple of gates. These are a nice addition. I think if you really wanted to, you could modify these and model them open. There's a bunch of end parts so that you don't have to have odd-looking squared walls, which is a nice touch as well. So, that's what's in the box. Let's get painting. I primed these with a rattle can from the hardware store. The detail on these parts is pretty chunky, so I wasn't too worried about losing detail or anything like that if the rattle can sprayed it out a little bit too thick. I figure it's cheaper than using hobby-specific primer, and I have it on hand, so I might as well use it up. I base coat all of the stone wall parts. I don't use my regular miniature paints for this. It would just use too much, and that would get expensive quickly. Instead, I'm using dark grey high flow acrylic from Global Colours, which seems to be only available from Riot Art and Craft in Australia. It wasn't as cheap as the tubes of Joe Sonia's paint that I often use, but they didn't have any greys when I went looking for a darker grey than I already had, so I'm trying this one out because why not? Just about any artist's acrylic will do though. I prefer the more liquid ones, and this one is so thin that you can airbrush with it right out of the bottle, though at this point I simply brush the grey on using a cheap brush. The brush I'm using in this clip is quite small, and in fact I did change to a bigger brush after I filmed this bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, I just wanted to get a decent and fairly solid coating. I applied 2 layers and that was enough. It's okay if tiny bits of black primer show through though. It'll add to the rocky look and probably be hidden with other colours later anyway. Once the grey is dry and I'm satisfied with it, I picked out some of the individual rocks with black. For this I'm using black primer because it covers really well and I didn't want to do multiple coats. This doesn't need to be perfect, but I'm obviously trying to paint the rocks individually, staying within the lines. Not that they have lines, but they do have defined edges. I didn't add a lot of these black rocks, they're fairly sparse and spread out. If you're doing this, you can paint as many of the stones black as you want. I follow this by picking out a few more rocks with brown earth, a Joe Sonia's artist's acrylic, though just about any brown you like could be used. I apply this to a few more stones than I did with the black, again trying to spread it out and make it look random, though it's hard not to try and make patterns and pick out the most interesting shapes. It's also tempting to try and spell things out. It takes a little while to pick these random bits out neatly, but I feel like the effort is going to be rewarded. Then I use another Joe Sonia's colour, Indian Red Oxide. I apply a lot less of this than the brown. It does kind of end up looking a bit similar to the brown and will probably not stand out from it later, but very subtle differences are what I want anyway. Finally, I repeat the process with Joe Sonia's Provincial Beige. Again, not too much of this colour. At least this one is obviously different to the brown I applied earlier. The hope is that it will make individual rocks stand out a little bit more, and add some interest to what would otherwise be a plain, boring, repetitious stone wall. We don't really have a lot of stone walls like this where I live, but I don't think the rocks in any of them have rocks of exactly the same colour, so why should the model? Though real stone walls never seem to have colours so obviously different to each other as this does, so it's going to need to be toned down a little bit and blended into the grey base colour. To do this, I lightly airbrushed the grey base colour over the pieces. I obviously don't want to obscure all the individual rocks I just picked out because that would be a waste of time. I just want to make them look a lot more faded, so I apply this grey gradually until I'm satisfied with it, though I do think I might have gone overboard in a couple of spots. The result is a lot better, in my opinion at least. The different colours are there, but they no longer have that stark contrast that jumps out at you. I then apply a kind of a wash, though I guess it's not really much of a wash at all, more of a filter maybe. Either way, it's Jo Sonja's Carbon Black thinned roughly 1 part paint to 3 parts water. I try not to apply this too heavily, and unlike a wash, I keep brushing it on so that it isn't pooling on the model or anything like that, and it blends in. This does go into the gaps between the rocks like a wash, but it also just darkens everything down and makes it look much more dirty and aged. I guess if you wanted more pronounced gaps, you could go over them with another wash focusing only on the gaps, but I didn't feel like that was necessary. This step has added another level of natural inconsistency and colour variation that I quite like. Next, I figured it was time for some dry brushing. At first, I tried doing this with the paint I used to base coat the walls, but it was a bit thin straight out of the bottle to use for dry brushing, so it was barely visible. It seems to work pretty well for airbrushing, but for dry brushing, at least in this instance, I want something a little bit thicker that I only need to do 1 layer of. Instead, I used Jo Sonja's Nimbus Grey, which is a bit lighter than I had initially wanted, but it works fine. I apply the dry brushing along the tops of the walls in a mostly downward motion over the sides of each wall. I do this fairly lightly, because I don't really want stark highlights, just a little bit of lightening around the edges of the stones to try and give them a bit of definition. I think the result is pretty good. I had initially intended to do 2 highlights. The Nimbus Grey was going to be the lighter and second of the 2, but I was happy with how this turned out and so I left it. The stone walls are now complete in my opinion, though there's always some fiddling that could be done to improve them, and I could spend a lot more time fussing over small details and such, but in this case I'm not going to. I'm calling it done. You can probably see that there's something missing though. Gates. I deliberately left these until last, mostly to avoid getting greys and black wash on the wood-coloured parts and having to do unnecessary cleanup. I start this with a base coat of Jo Sonja's brown earth that I used before on the rocks. It should look totally different in this application. I apply it as neatly as I can, trying to avoid getting the paint on the stone areas. Again, I want to avoid unnecessary cleanup. The 2 gates are pretty small, so if you wanted to, it wouldn't be such a big waste if you were to use your good miniatures paint on these. I didn't want to because, well, I already had the tube of brown earth out anyway. I apply a fairly good and solid coat on the gates, and when it's dry, I apply a fairly heavy dry brushing with the provincial beige I used before. I focus this on the corners of the planks, but the entire thing does get at least a touch of beige. I wasn't sure if this would look any good, but I think it worked out quite well. I used a smaller brush to do this than when I was dry brushing the walls themselves to avoid getting the beige on the stones. You can see what a difference this simple step can make. Next, I apply a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone mixed roughly 50-50 with water. This is applied only to the gate parts, and I tried not to apply it too heavily. If I want this to be a bit darker, I could do another layer of it when it's dry, but it looks about done to me. The only thing left to do is add protective clear coats, which I haven't done yet. I could of course spend more time adding more detail and refining even further. I could put a wash into the gaps between the stones, or add a dust effect, or even some moss or vines or something, but I think that's enough for some quick and relatively simple stone fences. They're somewhat uniform in colour, but there's still a lot of variety and interest in that simple greyness. I was too lazy to set up a gaming table to display these properly, but this piece of grassy MDF will give some idea of how they might look. Pretty nice, I think. You can probably see that I've missed a spot on the gate, and some of the end parts should have received more attention. It slipped my mind that they'd be exposed. I could have also picked out the hinges on the gates with a rusty colour perhaps. Oh well, that's something for me to touch up later, and maybe for you to keep in mind if you're going to be painting something similar. I think the techniques I've shown here are pretty simple and a good way to get nice looking stone walls, both stone fences and walls of structures. You can vary the colours to taste, and you can add as many or as few different coloured rocks as you would like. It all depends on how much time you want to spend and the effect you're looking for. I think the stone walls themselves are pretty good. They're a good and easy option if you don't want to make your own stone walls, though making your own is probably cheaper. There is pretty much no assembly for the kit, if you would in fact call it a kit. I probably wouldn't. The only problem I had was with the joints between the parts. The fit is a bit tight, and because I got paint in the joins, the fit is even tighter. I even had to scrape some of the paint off to get them to go together. It's not really a huge issue, though it might be worth sanding them down a little bit before painting just to allow for the thickness of the paint. So, what do you think? Would you hide your infantry behind these walls? Do you prefer building your own? Let me know in the comment section below. And don't forget to do things like subscribing here on YouTube, following me on social media, and watching me live stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider helping to support the channel over at patreon.com/HerbertErpaderp. That would be awesome. Check the links in the description for further information. I shall return soon, so until then, happy wall building and thanks for watching. Farewell.